What if I told you a team just traded away a 23-year-old superstar, not because she wasn't producing, but because they couldn't handle what came with her? Because that's exactly what just happened to Angel Reese, and the more you look into it, the worse it gets. This wasn't some quiet, under-the-radar move either. The moment news broke that the Chicago Sky was sending their franchise player to the Atlanta Dream, everything exploded. Fans were confused, analysts were stunned, and almost immediately, one question started taking over the conversation. How do you trade a player like that for so little? We're talking about a two-time All-Star, one of the most dominant rebounders the league has ever seen at her age, a player who was supposed to be the face of the franchise for the next decade. And yet somehow, she's gone for draft picks that might not even come close to replacing her impact. But here, where it gets interesting. This wasn't just about basketball. Because if you've been paying attention, the signs were there long before the trade ever happened. The losing, the instability, the tension building behind the scenes, it all pointed to something bigger than just wins and losses. And now, with Reese heading to a team that's already built to compete, the narrative is starting to flip fast. Because while Chicago is trying to explain why they made this move, Atlanta might have just pulled off one of the biggest steals we've seen in years. And once you understand what really led to this decision, you start to realize something. This wasn't just a trade. It was a breaking point. The moment the news dropped, everything stopped. No warning, no build-up, just one update, and suddenly Angel Reese was no longer part of the Chicago Sky. She was headed to the Atlanta Dream. And within minutes, the reaction said it all. Fans weren't just surprised, they were furious. Social media lit up instantly, and not because Reese asked out, not because her performance dropped, but because the return didn't make sense. 2 future first-round picks, that's it. No proven star, no immediate replacement, just potential. And that's where the confusion turned into disbelief. Because we're not talking about a role player here. Reese is a 2-time All-Star, a record-setting rebounder, and one of the most recognizable faces in the league. A 23-year-old cornerstone who should be untouchable in most situations. And yet, Chicago moved her like a team trying to reset, not build. Now on paper, draft picks always sound valuable. Teams sell hope all the time. Future assets, flexibility, long-term vision. But here, the problem. Those picks are coming from Atlanta. A team that just finished at the top of the standings and is already built to win. Which means those valuable picks, they're likely landing in the middle of the draft. Not top-tier talent, not guaranteed stars, just prospects. So when you really break it down, Chicago didn't just trade a superstar. They traded certainty for a gamble. And that's why this move hit so hard. Because it feels less like a strategy and more like an exit. An organization choosing to move on from its best player without getting equal value in return. And when that happens, people start asking questions, not about the player, but about the front office. Why now? Why this deal? And what happened behind the scenes that made this feel like the only option? Because trades like this don't just happen in a vacuum. They happen when something bigger is going on. And if this is how it started, what comes next might be even more revealing. But here's the thing, this didn't just happen overnight. If you were really paying attention to the Chicago Sky, the warning signs were there the entire time. They were just easy to ignore. It started with the losing. A 10-34 season isn't just bad, it's a signal. A team that far from contention isn't dealing with one problem, it's dealing with everything. Roster issues, chemistry problems, directionless leadership. And through all of that, Angel Reese was still producing at an elite level. But that's where the disconnect began. Because while Reese was putting up historic numbers, the team around her was falling apart. Key players went down with injuries. The offense lacked structure, and night after night, it felt like she was carrying a situation that wasn't built to succeed. Then came the instability. In just a short span, the sky cycled through multiple coaching changes. Systems kept changing, roles kept shifting, and when that happens, players don't just lose games, they lose trust, because it starts to feel like there's no real plan. And when there's no plan, frustration builds. Now, none of this was always loud or public. In fact, most of it stayed beneath the surface. But reports and reactions throughout the season suggested that things weren't as stable as they appeared. Body language, post-game comments, small moments that didn't seem like much at the time, but added up over weeks and months. And here's the key part. When a young star is trying to win, and the environment around them keeps breaking down, something eventually gives. Not always dramatically, not always all at once, but slowly. The expectations stop matching reality. The patience runs thin, and the situation becomes harder to fix. So by the time the trade actually happened, it didn't feel like the beginning of something. It felt like the end of something that had been building for a while. And once you see it that way, the move becomes a lot easier to understand. But that doesn't mean it was the right decision. Because what happened next would prove that this situation wasn't just about losing games, it was about something much deeper. And then came the moment that quietly changed everything. It wasn't a trade, it wasn't a game, it was an interview. Late in the season, Angel Reese sat down and said what most players usually keep to themselves. She talked about wanting to win, about needing better pieces around her, about not being satisfied with how things were going inside the Chicago sky. And just like that, the tone shifted. Now, to be fair, nothing she said was completely out of line. A lot of it reflected what fans were already seeing. A struggling roster, a team nowhere near contention, a season that felt like it was slipping away early. But the difference was, she said it out loud. And that matters. Because in professional sports, it's not just what you say, it's when and how you say it. Reports suggest that those comments didn't sit well internally. What may have been intended as honesty started being viewed as criticism. What sounded like competitiveness started being interpreted as frustration with the organization itself. And from that point forward, things felt different. The response wasn't explosive, it was subtle. A suspension, reduced appearances, then suddenly she's dealing with a back issue and disappears from the lineup. No clear explanation. No dramatic announcement, just gone. And she never played another game for Chicago again. Now, was that all directly because of the interview? That part isn't officially confirmed, but the timing raised questions, because everything seemed to change right after that moment. And when you connect the dots, it starts to look less like coincidence and more like a turning point. Because what that interview really did wasn't just create headlines, it exposed the gap between a player who wanted to compete and a team that wasn't ready to meet that standard. And once that gap becomes public, it's hard to close it. Trust gets tested, relationships get strained, and decisions that once felt unlikely suddenly become possible. So by the time the trade talks started heating up, it wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about whether both sides still believed in the same direction. And based on how this ended, that answer was already clear. But here, where the story goes from surprising to a pattern you can't ignore. Because what happened with Angel Reese isn't new for the Chicago sky. It just feels new because it's happening again, this time in front of everyone. Go back a few years and you'll start to see it. Sylvia Fowles, one of the most dominant centers the league has ever seen, didn't just leave Chicago, she forced her way out. Reports at the time suggested frustration with how the team was being run and built. She ends up with the Minnesota Lynx and wins championships. Then there, Elena Del Don, another franchise-level talent, another player who didn't see a long-term future in Chicago. She gets traded to Washington and becomes a champion there too. And it doesn't stop there. Candace Parker, arguably one of the biggest names in women's basketball, also moved on after her time in Chicago. And once again, success followed her elsewhere. Now, no two situations are exactly the same. Every player has their own reasons, every era is different. But when the same outcome keeps happening, stars leaving and then thriving somewhere else, it stops looking like coincidence. It starts looking like a trend. And that's the uncomfortable part for Chicago. Because this isn't about finding talent, they've proven they can do that. It's about keeping it, building around it, creating an environment where elite players actually want to stay long-term. And based on what we've seen, that's where things keep breaking down. Some observers have pointed to front office decisions. Others mention instability, lack of direction, or failure to adapt. None of it has been officially confirmed as the single reason, but the results speak for themselves. Star arrives. Expectations rise. Frustration builds. Star leaves. And history repeats. So when Reese becomes the latest name on that list, it doesn't feel shocking anymore. It feels familiar. And that's what makes this trade hit even harder. Because it suggests the problem wasn't just this situation. It's something the organization still hasn't figured out. And until they do, this probably won't be the last time we see this story play out. But here's the part that really makes this situation hard to ignore, because once you look behind the scenes, it starts to explain everything. This wasn't just about wins and losses. It was about the environment. Reports and player comments over the past year have painted a picture that doesn't match what you'd expect from a major market team like the Chicago Sky. We're talking about a franchise where, as has been widely discussed, players were practicing in a public recreation facility, not a private, state-of-the-art training center, a shared space. Let that sink in for a second. A professional team in one of the biggest cities in the country, sharing facilities with the general public. And it didn't stop there. Veteran player Rebecca Allen openly described her experience as a little bit miserable. She talked about moments where players were changing in locker rooms next to random people. No separation, no privacy, no sense of a high-level professional setup. Now, none of this has been officially labeled as the sole reason players leave, but it adds context. Because when you combine that with everything else, losing seasons, coaching changes, roster instability, it starts to paint a much bigger picture. This isn't just a basketball problem. It's an infrastructure problem. It's an investment problem. And most importantly, it's a trust problem. Because players notice these things. They compare situations. They see how other organizations operate. They see the resources, the support systems, the commitment to winning. And when that gap becomes obvious, it affects how they view their future. So when someone like Angel Reese, a highly competitive, high-motor player, finds herself in that kind of environment, the frustration starts to make a lot more sense. It's not just about touches or stats. It's about feeling like the organization matches your ambition. And if that alignment isn't there, it creates tension. The kind of tension that builds quietly over time. Until eventually, something has to change. And in this case, it did. Because once you realize what players were dealing with behind the scenes, the trade doesn't just feel shocking anymore. It feels inevitable. And while Chicago is trying to explain this move, the other side of this story looks completely different. Because for the Atlanta Dream, this isn't just a trade, it's a steal. This is a team that was already trending upward. A strong season, a clear identity, a system that actually works. And now, they've just added Angel Reese to that foundation without giving up anything close to equal value. Think about the timing. Atlanta didn't need to make a desperate move. They weren't rebuilding. They weren't searching for a star. They already had pieces in place, with players like Alicia Gray leading offensively and Ryan Howard anchoring both ends of the floor. What they needed was someone who could elevate everything around them. And that's exactly what Reese brings. But here, what makes this fit so dangerous? She doesn't have to carry the team anymore. In Chicago, the pressure was constant. Every night felt like she had to do everything: score, rebound, lead, energize. And while she delivered, that kind of load isn't sustainable, especially in a losing environment. In Atlanta, that changes instantly. Now she can focus on what she does best: dominating the glass, setting the tone defensively, bringing that relentless energy that shifts momentum. She doesn't need to be the #1 option, she just needs to be herself. And that's when players like her become even more impactful. Because when you take a high-motor player and put them into a winning system with structure, spacing, and stability, their strengths don't just show up, they multiply. That's what Atlanta is betting on. And based on how this roster is built, it's not a risky bet. It's a calculated move. Because while Chicago is looking toward the future, hopping those picks turn into something, Atlanta is focused on right now. Winning now, competing now, building something real now. And if everything clicks the way it looks on paper, this won't just be a good trade for the dream. It could be the move that changes the entire balance of the league. But not everyone sees this move the same way, and that's where the debate really starts. Because while a lot of people are calling this a massive win for Angel Reese, there's also a growing group of critics asking a different question. Is she actually as dominant as people think? You've probably seen the arguments. Some say her rebounding numbers are inflated, that a portion of those boards come from her own missed shots. Others point to her efficiency, hovering around the low 40% range, and question whether she can truly be a go-to scorer on a championship team. And then there's the outside shooting, or lack of it. Defenders don't exactly fear her stretching the floor. Now, to be fair, those aren't completely baseless criticisms. Every young player has areas to improve, and Reese is no exception. The modern game demands versatility, and adding a consistent mid-range or three-point shot would take her to another level. But here, where the conversation starts to shift. Because what those critiques often ignore is context. Reese is 23 years old, 2 seasons into her career. Already a 2-time All-Star. Already one of the most dominant rebounders the league has ever seen at this stage. And more importantly, she's improving. Her efficiency has already taken a noticeable jump from year 1 to year 2. Her decision-making is evolving. Her overall impact on the game goes far beyond just scoring. Energy, physicality, presence, the kind of things that don't always show up in a stat sheet, but absolutely change outcomes. And then there's something else critics don't always account for. The situation she was in. It's a lot easier to pick apart a player's weaknesses when they're playing on a struggling team with inconsistent spacing, limited support, and constant pressure to carry the load. That environment doesn't highlight strengths, it exposes flaws. But in a system like the Atlanta Dream, that changes. Now she's surrounded by structure, by shooters, by players who can take pressure off her, and when that happens, roles become clearer and players become more efficient. So the real question is whether Reese is perfect. It's whether she's been properly positioned to succeed. And if Atlanta gets that part right, this entire, overrated conversation might disappear faster than people expect. But here's the part that hasn't gotten enough attention, and it might actually explain why this trade happened in the first place. The money is about to change everything. The WNBA is entering a new era with an updated collective bargaining agreement, and with it, player salaries are expected to rise significantly. We're not talking about small increases either. We're talking about a major jump that could completely reshape how teams build their rosters. And that's where Angel Reese comes into the picture. Up to this point, she's been on a rookie deal, making a relatively modest salary compared to her impact and marketability. But under the new system, reports suggest players of her caliber could soon be earning several times that amount. And that creates a decision point. Because for the Chicago Sky, it's been said that committing that kind of money to their current roster might not have aligned with their long-term vision, especially when you consider their record, their spacing issues, and the uncertainty around how the team was constructed. Now, to be clear, there's no official statement saying this was the main reason for the trade, but when you look at the timing, it raises questions. Because instead of building around a young star entering her prime, they chose to move on before that financial commitment became unavoidable. And that's what makes this decision so controversial. Because teams don't usually trade players like Reese at 23 years old. You build around them, you invest in them, you figure out how to make it work. But Chicago didn't do that. They looked at the situation, the roster, the future costs, the current results, and decided to reset. And in doing so, they may have traded away not just a player, but their future. Meanwhile, the Atlanta Dream are stepping into that opportunity without hesitation. They're not worried about what Reese might cost down the line. They're focused on what she brings right now. And that difference in approach, that's what could define how this trade is remembered. Because if Reese develops the way many expect, and Atlanta turns into a contender, then this won't just be seen as a bold move by Chicago. It'll be remembered as the moment they let a superstar walk before she even reached her peak. And when you put all of this together, it leaves you with one uncomfortable reality. This trade wasn't just a mistake, it might be a repeat of history. Because the Chicago Sky have been here before, a rising star, frustration building, a decision to move on, and then watching that same player go somewhere else and win. Now it's Angel Reese's turn. A 23-year-old, already a two-time All-Star, already rewriting record books, already proving she can impact games at the highest level, and instead of building around her, Chicago chose to reset again. Meanwhile, everything is lining up perfectly for the Atlanta Dream. A winning system, established talent, clear direction, and now a player with something to prove. Because if there's one thing this move just did, it added fuel, motivation, that edge that great players tap into when they feel overlooked. And that's what makes this so dangerous. Because if Reese thrives in Atlanta, if she elevates that team, makes a deep playoff run, or even pushes for a championship, this won't just be seen as a bad trade. It'll be remembered as the moment Chicago lost control of its future. But here's the bigger question. Was this really about basketball? Or was it about everything that came with it? The pressure, the expectations, the friction behind the scenes? Because depending on how this plays out, the answer to that question is going to matter a lot. For Chicago, for Atlanta, and for every team watching this situation unfold. So now it comes down to this. Will Reese become the next star to leave Chicago and win somewhere else? Or will this decision somehow prove the Sky right? Because one thing is certain. We're not going to have to wait long to find out.